Welcome to the National Archives. This building is home to over 12 million boxes of documents which span 1,000 years of history. Some of the records kept here are very old and some are more modern. The National Archives preserves these documents on behalf of the government. My name is Hannah and I work in the education team here at the Archives. Today we'll be opening one of our document files to see what it can reveal about LGBTQ+ lives in the past. Let's take a look inside. The cover of the file is marked with a code, CRIM. Each document at the Archives has its own unique code, and codes often give us a clue about who produced the document and why it might be kept here. In this case, CRIM stands for a longer word, criminal. We'll return to this later on. As I open this file, you'll see it contains many different types of documents. The document that we're looking for is right at the back, and I have to make sure that I handle the document really carefully, so I'm going to do this quite slowly. We try not to touch the writing on documents, and because it has a treasury tag, we need to pull that through every single time we turn a page. So our document is actually housed in what looks a bit like a book. So I'm going to open up the book and show you. Here we have a black and white photograph. In it we can see a group of people gathered together. Most are men, but a woman also appears in the photograph. She looks directly at the camera as others look away in different directions or appear disinterested. One man can be seen reclining in an armchair. They look to be sitting in a living room. There is a fireplace in the corner and the room is decorated with Eastern-inspired lamps and a printed screen. The photograph has also been annotated with names added in ink above some of the individuals pictured. One note appears above a man who is bare-chested and wearing a long skirt and a printed headscarf. It reads Brit. This was Bobby Britt. Bobby was 27 years old at this time and a dancer on stage in the West End in London. He was working class and his family were cigarette makers and dressmakers. We can turn to another document in this file to find out more about the context in which the photograph was taken. A number of items of clothing appear in this list, including Bobby Britt's black transparent skirt, a red sash, a pair of ladies' slippers, a bathing costume, a suit of pyjamas, as well as photographs and letters addressed to Britt. This document is a list of exhibits. This reveals that these items were gathered by police and used as evidence in a criminal trial. Think back to that document code we saw earlier. But why did the police enter Bobby's flat? And why were these items of interest to them? Vicky Iglikowski-Broad, Principal Record Specialist in Diverse Histories at the National Archives, can tell us more.
We can imagine what it might have been like at the time to be attending this venue. It was December 1927. This was a place that finally these men could go and feel relatively safe and certainly welcome. And they would have been greeted probably by Bobby Britt, who would have opened the door and welcomed them into the house in Fitzroy Square in the basement where he lived. He would have probably opened the door wearing his very flamboyant outfit, his skirt with the gold around the edges, and there would have been likely chatter and laughter, dancing and the gramophone to be heard. It would have been a welcoming environment, but there would have been a lot of risk involved in being there because of the situation at the time, the way that society essentially criminalised men loving men. While it was never illegal as such to be gay or for men to love other men, society didn't broadly approve and the law criminalised sexual behaviours between men. One of the contradictions of the records is that we have this amazing material, but it's because of the criminalisation of these people's loves in the past. But it does now give us an incredible insight into these LGBT safe spaces from the 1920s and similar eras. There were associated clubs and spaces at this time as well, but this is a unique example as a private dwelling, someone's home where people would gather for parties and as a safe space. We know a lot about these records because of the way there was surveillance at the time. So the police, we know, would watch the individuals going into the house at Fitzroy Square, but they'd also watch them from rooftops nearby, and they would observe through the windows where possible. People inside knew that they were vulnerable to being policed, And so they would make sure the curtains were closed and try and protect their space as well. One of the amazing insights we get from this file is a selection of letters that relate to people who were gathering in Fitzroy Square in the basement. These were letters that were sent to these individuals. They're essentially love letters, but also letters between gay men from the 1920s. So some of them are about friendship, some of them are about love. They're all about community and spaces that people were going to at the time. And that's an incredible insight and something really rare to have now surviving in our collections. Bobby Britt, who we saw in the photograph earlier, lived to be 100. He was born in 1900 and so would have seen many, many changes in the law throughout his lifetime. In 1967, the Sexual Offences Act was passed, which partially decriminalised homosexual acts in private. There would have been so many changes, for the better hopefully, in Bobby's lifetime that would mean future generations wouldn't have to go through what Bobby went through. Now, we saw Bobby opening the door and greeting people, and he would have done dances for them. We do know that throughout his life, Bobby was also a dancer.
Despite the fact that our records were gathered by police through surveillance, they give us an insight into the fact that Bobby Britt's flat was a vibrant hub and meeting place for the LGBTQ+ community, an insight we might not otherwise have. They can also reveal much about the attitudes of the police towards the LGBTQ+ community in the 1920s. However, because our documents are often from a police or government perspective, it is very important to find documents from other viewpoints in other archival collections. So we've travelled to the Bishopsgate Institute, where we're going to meet Stef Dickers, who's going to speak about some different types of documents that can tell us about LGBTQ+ history.
Hi, my name's Stef Dickers. I'm the Special Collections and Archives Manager at Bishopsgate Institute in London, and it's my absolute joy every day to look after the huge LGBTQ+ collections we hold here at the Institute. We've been collecting LGBTQ+ history since 2011. We've now amassed one of the largest collections documenting LGBTQ+ lives and experiences over the past hundreds or so years. We collect a slightly different way here than other places collect, and I'd been working in archives a long time and learnt about how I wanted to collect in a slightly different way. One, we welcome anyone's collection here at the Institute. Anyone wants to share their queer history can come in, donate what they fancy, whether it be a flyer, a jumper, whatever they fancy. And these are regarded as wonderfully as archives from big organisations and big celebrity people. Also, it's about making queer history and LGBTQ+ history as accessible as possible here. So if you come in and wanting to look at the archives, you don't need to bring along a letter from your tutor or your mother's birth certificate or do 50 press-ups. We just get you straight in and get you sat down and looking at stuff. So the first item I want to show you is an item that was brought into us one day, and a young lady came in and said she wanted to deposit the diaries of her Uncle Bill. So we took them in, wonderfully, very excited. And as we had a little dig through, we realised how actually wonderful they were. Now, they record the life of someone called William Mahoney, who was a guy who lived around the turn of the century till into the 80s. But the diaries record his life living together with his partner Doug. So few records of this kind survive, recording the life of gay men prior to 1967. So they're absolutely a wonderful record of these two men living together in Brixton in London, day to day, what they got up to. Now, when I got these in and mentioned this to a few LGBT historians who were very excited, they got very excited. They thought these are going to be so wonderfully in, all sort of very under the radar, trilby hats, dark corners. But they are quite possibly the most mundane diaries we've ever seen. Wonderfully about, dinner not being cooked properly and how bad cinema was. But this almost makes them even more magical in the sense that they are just the record of a couple in love from the 40s to the 1970s, regardless of whether it's two men, two women, a man and a woman. They do end with a very sad note, I'm afraid. When Doug dies, William's partner, in 1972, Bill keeps on carrying on keeping diaries, but every day ends the diary with "Good night, Doug, God bless you." They're a wonderful record of a couple living together in Britain when it was illegal to do so. Second item I'd like to show you is a wonderful one that's quite recently come to the archive, and we've been delighted to accept the archive of a football club called Stonewall FC. Now, Stonewall FC were the first football club put together by gay men. They started in 1991. A gentleman put an advert in Time Out magazine saying, "Are there any other gay guys out there who want to play football?" And they've now grown and grown and grown. They played at Wembley Stadium, and they've now diversified as well. They have women's teams, non-binary teams. But this is one of their very early training jackets. Talking to the people who were involved in Stonewall FC, I was really struck about how political this was to be a member of a gay football team in 1991. They talked about the courage it took to go on the pitch as an openly gay team and play against non-gay teams. It was quite inspiring to hear about the courage it took to do this, and one gentleman who played for the team in the early days talked to me about how he had to change his shirt at half-time where he'd been spat on by members of the other team for being gay. So this is sort of illustrative about how the archives is collected here. Even though this is not expressly a political archive, it is in itself, and the courage it took for these guys to get a team together and go out and play was quite wonderful. So the last item I've got is a selection of badges from various gay prides over the years. So the first ever pride took place in London in 1972, and from the mid-70s they started producing badges for each pride. So you go along to pride, you'd buy a badge, and you would wear that as a sense of pride. And you'd wear it long after the pride took place as well, as a source of pride and sort of identification to the community. So we have hundreds and hundreds of badges here. These are some of the selections from the 1980s. I mean, I'm afraid 1983 is definitely my favourite one. But they stopped producing them in the mid-90s, but I'm pleased to say badges are making a bit of comeback, and we're now collecting lots more badges that come in. So if you do make a badge, make sure you donate one to the archive. But they're wonderful things, and it shows how, as well, not always archives are documents and photographs. They can be little artefacts like this, or even bigger artefacts such as placards and banners as well. But they're wonderfully visible, and it's interesting to see how the community is representing itself through the pride badges as well. Here it's about recording the whole experiences of LGBTQ plus Britain. A lot of archives focus very much on protest and moments when the community have been under attack. But here it's very much about celebrating the stories, about moments of joy as well as moments of sorrow. All of queer life should be recorded, not just marching on protests and campaigning.